Elderly woman returns from death with a shocking message from Jesus. Margaret's day began like any other, peaceful and predictable. She awoke early to the soft light of dawn streaming through her lace curtains. Her modest home, filled with photos of her children and grandchildren, radiated a sense of warmth and history. It was the kind of house that felt like a hug. The walls lined with framed memories, the air always carrying the faint scent of baked goods or fresh flowers from her garden. At 83 years old, Margaret found joy in these little rituals, the quiet rhythm of a life well lived. That morning, she brewed her favorite coffee, humming a tune as she poured it into her well-worn mug. It was a special day. Her youngest grandson, Tommy, was coming over after school, and she was determined to make it memorable. Tommy loved her oatmeal cookies, the best in the world, he always declared, and Margaret had a batch planned just for him. She smiled at the thought, picturing his face lighting up as he devoured her handiwork. Margaret moved through her morning with purpose, savoring the simplicity of her routine. She laid out her ingredients on the counter, her hands steady despite her age. The worn recipe card she had written decades ago sat propped up next to her flour jar. It was a card she knew by heart but kept close anyway, a comforting relic of the past. As she reached for the jar, she noticed the sunlight dancing across the tablecloth, casting a golden glow over the room. She paused for a moment, appreciating the beauty of it. But then something strange happened. A sudden, sharp pain pierced her chest, so intense it took her breath away. She gasped, clutching the counter for support. It felt as though an invisible hand was pressing down on her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. For a fleeting moment, she tried to brush it off, convincing herself it was nothing more than a passing discomfort. She was, after all, strong, resilient. The pain didn't fade. Instead, it grew, spreading like wildfire. Her legs began to tremble, and a wave of dizziness washed over her. Her vision blurred, the golden sunlight now a distant haze. Margaret's grip on the counter loosened, and she felt her body crumple to the floor. The cold linoleum pressed against her cheek, and for a moment, she tried to move, to cry out for help. But her strength was gone. The last thing she saw was the sunlight filtering through her curtains, soft and serene, as everything around her faded into darkness. Unbeknownst to Margaret, her daughter Emily had decided to stop by that morning. Emily often visited unannounced, finding joy in surprising her mother and sharing a cup of tea. But as she stepped through the front door, expecting to find Margaret bustling around the kitchen, she was met with an eerie silence. Something was wrong. "Mum?" Emily called out, her voice tinged with concern. When no reply came, her heart began to race. She moved quickly through the house, her footsteps echoing in the quiet. As she entered the kitchen, she froze, her breath catching in her throat. There, on the floor, was her mother, motionless. Panic gripped Emily as she dropped to her knees beside Margaret, her hands trembling as she checked for a pulse. There was nothing. Tears filled her eyes as she fumbled for her phone, her voice breaking as she called for an ambulance. "My mum's not breathing," she managed to say, her words spilling out in a desperate rush. "Please, hurry." The paramedics arrived within minutes, their movements efficient and practiced. They began chest compressions, their voices calm but urgent as they worked to revive Margaret. The kitchen, once filled with the warmth of baking and sunlight, was now a scene of frantic determination. Emily stood in the corner, her hands clasped tightly together as she whispered prayers through her sobs. The world seemed to stand still, the ticking clock on the wall the only reminder of time moving forward. For 11 agonizing minutes, Margaret's heart had stopped. The paramedics did everything in their power, compressions, defibrillation, oxygen, but her body remained unresponsive. Emily's knees buckled as she watched, her mind racing through memories of her mother, unable to comprehend the possibility of losing her. It was as though the walls of the home she had grown up in were closing in, suffocating her with the weight of the moment. But while the paramedics fought to bring Margaret back, something extraordinary was happening to her. What no one in that room could have imagined was that Margaret was no longer there. Not entirely. Her body lay lifeless on the floor, but her soul had begun a journey she would never forget. Margaret later described the sensation as being lifted, weightless and free. It was as though every ache and burden she had ever carried had been stripped away, leaving her in a state of pure peace. She could see her kitchen from above, her body lying still as the paramedics worked. She could hear Emily's cries, could feel the anguish in the room, but it all felt distant, as though she were observing a scene from another life. And then the kitchen dissolved. The walls, the floor, even the figures below faded away, replaced by an all-encompassing light. It was golden and radiant, a warmth that surrounded her like an embrace. Margaret couldn't describe it in words, only that it felt like coming home, a place she had always longed for without realizing it. She felt no fear, only an overwhelming sense of love and belonging. Shapes began to emerge within the light, soft and glowing, their presence familiar yet indescribable. Margaret felt drawn to them as though they were old friends welcoming her back. She had no questions, no doubts. For the first time in her 83 years, she felt truly whole. But amidst the peace, there was a growing sense of purpose, an unspoken call pulling her forward. And it was then that she saw him. Margaret moved toward the glowing figures in the light, her steps weightless, as if she were being carried by an unseen current. She couldn't make out their faces, yet she felt as though she had known them forever. There was no need for words. Their presence alone filled her with a profound sense of peace and love. But as she drew closer, her focus shifted. Among the radiant shapes stood one figure that shone brighter than the rest, its presence commanding yet gentle. Margaret felt her breath catch, not that she was breathing in the way she did on earth, but the sensation of awe was the same. This figure radiated an energy unlike anything she had ever experienced. It wasn't just the light or the warmth. It was the undeniable feeling of pure love. Love so deep and unconditional that it brought tears to her eyes. She didn't need to ask who it was. She knew instinctively and unequivocally that she was in the presence of Jesus. Margaret froze, overcome with emotion. She had spent her life as a woman of faith, attending church, praying, and finding solace in her belief. But nothing could have prepared her for this moment. Every sermon she had heard, every prayer she had uttered, now felt like faint echoes compared to the reality of standing before him. Jesus didn't speak at first. He simply looked at her, his eyes filled with a knowing kindness. It was as though he could see every moment of her life, all her joys, her sorrows, her regrets laid bare before him. Margaret expected to feel small or unworthy under such a gaze, but instead, she felt only love. There was no judgment, no condemnation, only an acceptance so complete that it brought her to her knees, not out of fear, but out of gratitude. As she knelt, she felt his presence reach out to her, not physically, but in a way that resonated deep within her soul. It was as though he was speaking directly to the very core of her being, bypassing words and filling her with an understanding she couldn't explain. She didn't need to ask why she was there. She felt that the answer was already unfolding around her. Then he spoke, not with words, but with a voice that echoed in her very existence. The sound wasn't heard, it was felt. "Margaret," he said, his tone steady and filled with purpose. "You have lived a life of love, but there is more to be done. The world is in need of truth, and you must be the one to carry it." Margaret's mind raced. Truth? What truth? She didn't understand what he meant, but she felt the weight of his words settle in her heart. She looked up at him, her voice trembling as she found the courage to respond. "What can I do? I'm just me." Jesus smiled, a smile that radiated reassurance and encouragement. "That is why you were chosen," he said. "You have lived humbly and loved deeply. People will listen to you, not because of who you are, but because of what you carry. There is a truth that has been hidden, and it is time for it to be revealed. But first, you must return." Margaret's heart sank at the thought. Return. The idea of leaving this place, this light, this presence, seemed unbearable. "But I don't want to go back," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I want to stay here, with you." Jesus knelt beside her, his gaze steady. "The world needs you, Margaret," he said gently. "There are those who are lost, blinded by lies, and they need to hear the message you will bring. You will not be alone. The light is always with you, even when it feels distant." Before Margaret could respond, she felt herself being pulled away. The golden light began to dim, the warmth receding. She reached out instinctively, wanting to hold on, but it was as though she were being gently but firmly guided back. The figures in the light grew fainter, their presence still comforting even as they faded from view. And then, with a sudden jolt, Margaret's eyes opened. She was lying on her kitchen floor, the sound of voices and the hum of machines filling her ears. The faces of paramedics hovered above her, their expressions a mixture of relief and astonishment. Her daughter, Emily, was kneeling beside her, clutching her hand and sobbing. "Mom!" Emily cried, her voice breaking. "You're alive!" Margaret blinked, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Her body felt heavy, weak, but her heart was full of something she couldn't quite put into words. She looked into Emily's tear-filled eyes and managed a faint smile. "I was sent back," she murmured, her voice hoarse but steady. "There's something I need to tell you." The paramedics exchanged glances, unsure of what she meant, but Emily leaned closer, her face pale with worry and confusion. "What are you talking about, Mom? What happened?" Margaret closed her eyes briefly, gathering her thoughts. How could she possibly explain what she had experienced? How could she convey the magnitude of the truth she had been entrusted with? She didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew one thing for certain: she had been sent back for a reason. Over the next few days, Margaret slowly regained her strength. But even as her body recovered, her mind was consumed by the mission she had been given. She felt a deep sense of urgency, as though time was slipping through her fingers. She began to recount her experience to her family, starting with Emily. At first, they were skeptical, unsure of how to process what she was saying. But as Margaret spoke, her conviction and clarity silenced their doubts. "There is a truth that has been hidden," Margaret told them, her voice steady despite the enormity of her words. "And we can't stay silent anymore. Jesus told me that the world is being blinded, misled, and that we must open our eyes before it's too late." Her family exchanged uneasy glances. "What does that mean?" Emily asked, her brow furrowed. "What truth are you talking about?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "I don't know all the details yet," she admitted. "But I know that this is bigger than any of us. It's about love, about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, and it's about helping others see the light before it's too late." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Margaret didn't know how she would fulfill the mission she had been given, but she knew she had to try. Every beat of her heart, every breath she took, was a reminder of the second chance she had been given, and the purpose that came with it. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, staring at her hands as they rested on the worn wood surface. Her family had gone quiet. the weight of her words lingering in the air. She had told them about the light, about Jesus, and about the truth she was meant to share. But as the days passed, she began to realize that sharing her story wasn't going to be as simple as she thought. Her daughter Emily was supportive but cautious. "Mum, I believe you," Emily said one afternoon, sitting beside her on the couch. "But this is a lot for people to take in. I'm worried that not everyone will understand. What if they think you're—" She hesitated, looking down. "What if they think I'm crazy?" Margaret finished for her, smiling gently. "Emily, that doesn't matter. What matters is the truth. I wasn't sent back to keep this to myself." Emily sighed, torn between admiration for her mother's courage and concern for what this could mean for her. But Margaret was resolute. She began sharing her story with friends and neighbors, speaking with the same calm conviction she had always carried. At first, there was skepticism. Some smiled politely, others asked hesitant questions, unsure if they believed what she was saying. But as Margaret spoke, something shifted. People couldn't deny the clarity in her eyes or the steadiness in her voice. One evening, her grandson David stopped by to visit. A college student with a curious mind, he had always been close to Margaret, drawn to her stories and her warmth. As she recounted her experience to him, he listened intently, his brow furrowed in thought. "Grandma," he said after a long pause, "this is incredible. But how do you expect to reach people outside of this town? I mean, you've got something big here. People need to hear it." Margaret tilted her head, considering his words. "I don't know," she admitted. "I just know that I need to start somewhere." David's eyes lit up. "I think I know someone who can help. Have you heard of Kai Madison Trump?" Margaret blinked, the name unfamiliar. "Who is that?" "She's Donald Trump's granddaughter," David explained. "But it's not just her family name. She's been speaking out lately, using her platform to talk about things that matter: truth, love, and finding purpose. If anyone can help you share your story, it's her." Margaret hesitated. The idea of reaching out to someone so high profile seemed daunting, but she trusted David's instincts. "If you think she'll listen," Margaret said, "then let's try." David wasted no time. He drafted an email, carefully outlining Margaret's story and why he thought it was important. To their surprise, they received a reply within days. Kai was intrigued and wanted to meet Margaret. Arrangements were made, and soon Margaret found herself preparing for a conversation that could change everything. When Kai arrived at Margaret's home, she wasn't what Margaret expected. Young and confident, Kai carried herself with a quiet strength that immediately put Margaret at ease. They sat together in the living room, the sunlight streaming through the window as Margaret began to share her story. Kai listened intently, her expression thoughtful, as Margaret spoke of her near-death experience, the light, and the message from Jesus. "The world is being misled," Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly. "And people need to see the truth before it's too late." When Margaret finished, Kai leaned back, her gaze steady. "This is powerful," she said. "Your story has the potential to wake people up, but we need to approach this carefully. People are skeptical these days, and the last thing we want is for your message to be dismissed." Margaret nodded. "I understand, but this isn't about me. It's about what I was sent back to share." Kai smiled. "Then let's make sure people hear it." Kai began using her platform to amplify Margaret's story, sharing snippets of their conversation on social media and speaking about the importance of truth and love in interviews. The reaction was immediate. Some were inspired, others skeptical, but one thing was certain: people were talking. Margaret's story had sparked a wave of curiosity and reflection. But as the attention grew, so did the challenges. There were critics who dismissed Margaret as delusional or accused her of seeking fame. Kai, however, remained steadfast. "This isn't about convincing everyone," she told Margaret one evening. "It's about reaching the people who are ready to listen. And believe me, they're out there." Margaret's story began to take on a life of its own. Churches invited her to speak, and community groups reached out, eager to hear her message. Each time she shared her experience, she emphasized the same themes: love, compassion, and the courage to seek the truth. "There is so much noise in the world," Margaret told one audience, her voice calm but firm. "But the truth is simple. It's about how we treat each other, how we stand up for what's right, and how we refuse to let fear keep us silent." Her words resonated deeply, especially with those who felt lost or uncertain in a world that often seemed chaotic. People began sharing their own stories, finding courage in Margaret's example. The ripple effect was undeniable. Kai continued to support Margaret, often reflecting on how much she had learned from her. "What Margaret reminds us," Kai said during an interview, "is that love and truth aren't just abstract ideas. They're choices we make every day in the way we live and the way we connect with each other. And those choices matter." Margaret, too, found herself inspired by the people she met along the way. Each conversation, each shared moment of vulnerability reaffirmed her belief that she had been sent back for a reason. She wasn't just telling a story, she was planting seeds of hope and courage in a world that desperately needed both. As Margaret sat by her window one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. She didn't know where her journey would take her next, but she trusted that she was on the right path. The light she had experienced, the love she had felt, it was still with her, guiding her every step. And she knew, deep in her heart, that her mission was far from over. Margaret's story was now out in the world, touching lives in ways she could never have anticipated. Every day, she received letters, emails, and messages from people who had seen her interviews or read about her experiences. Some came from skeptics, people who questioned her story or dismissed it as a fabrication. But many more came from those who had been deeply moved, people who found hope and meaning in her words. One message, in particular, stood out to Margaret. It was from a young woman named Clara, who wrote about how she had been struggling with feelings of despair and doubt. "I've always felt like there was something missing," Clara's message read. "Like I was walking through life without a purpose. But hearing your story reminded me that there's more to this world than we can see. Thank you for helping me believe again." Margaret sat at her kitchen table, reading the message with tears in her eyes. It wasn't the first time she'd received such a note, but each one carried the same profound weight. She had been sent back for a reason, and every word of gratitude reaffirmed her sense of purpose. Yet Margaret knew her mission was far from complete. Kai Madison Trump continued to be an unwavering supporter. Through her platform, Kai had connected Margaret with people and organizations eager to spread her message even further. "The world is hungry for truth," Kai said during a podcast appearance. "Margaret's story is more than just a near-death experience. It's a wake-up call for all of us to pay attention to what really matters." But not everyone was receptive. As Margaret's story gained traction, critics grew louder. They questioned her motives, accused her of seeking attention, and even suggested that her story was fabricated for fame. Margaret, however, remained calm in the face of criticism. She didn't need everyone to believe her. She simply needed to speak the truth. "It's not about convincing anyone," she told her family one evening as they gathered in her living room. "It's about planting seeds. The people who are meant to hear this will understand, even if it takes time." Her family watched in awe as Margaret continued her journey with unwavering determination. Emily, who had once been hesitant to believe her mother's story, now stood by her side as one of her biggest supporters. "Mom's not just telling a story," Emily said during an interview. "She's inspiring people to think about their lives in a different way, to find love, truth, and purpose in a world that often feels chaotic." Margaret's message began to evolve. While she still shared her near-death experience and the words of Jesus, she also started focusing on the practical implications of her story. "We can't just talk about love and truth," she told an audience during a community event. "We have to live it, in our actions, in our words, in the way we treat each other. That's how we make a difference." This shift resonated deeply with her audiences. People who had been unsure about her story found themselves moved by her emphasis on universal values. Margaret wasn't just speaking to people of faith, she was speaking to anyone who felt lost, disconnected, or unsure of their place in the world. One of the most powerful moments of Margaret's journey came during a large event organized by Kai. Hundreds of people had gathered to hear Margaret speak, and as she stood before them, she felt the presence of the light she had seen during her experience. It wasn't a physical light, but a warmth and energy that filled her heart and gave her strength. "Each of us has a choice," Margaret said, her voice steady and filled with conviction. "We can live in fear, divided and distracted, or we can choose love and truth. It's not always easy, but it's always worth it. Because when we choose love, we become the light the world so desperately needs." The audience was silent for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Then, one by one, people began to stand and applaud. Margaret's message had reached them, not just as a story, but as a call to action. After the event, Kai approached Margaret, her eyes shining with admiration. "You're doing something incredible," she said. "I don't think you realize how many lives you're changing." Margaret smiled, her expression serene. "It's not me," she said. "It's the light. I'm just the messenger." In the weeks that followed, Margaret continued to share her story with anyone willing to listen. But as her journey unfolded, she began to realize something profound. The message she had been sent to share wasn't just about revealing a hidden truth. It was about reminding people of the truth that had always been within them. "The light I saw," Margaret told her family one evening, "isn't something we have to wait for. It's already here within us. We just have to let it shine." As Margaret sat by her window, watching the sun set over the horizon, she felt a deep sense of peace. She didn't know what the future held, but she trusted the path she was on. The light was with her, as it always had been, and she knew that as long as she continued to share her message, she was fulfilling her purpose. Her story wasn't about proving anything or seeking validation. It was about love, courage, and the power of truth. And for those who heard her words and felt their impact, Margaret's journey became a reminder that even in the darkest moments, the light is never far away.